Welcome to the video lecture where we'll be discussing curriculum selections in education by focusing on the idea of teaching values. This week's readings are Indoctrination by William Kilpatrick and Values in Teaching and Teaching Values by Evangelina Frydakaya. Today's lecture will aim to address the following three questions. 1. How should we teach in a democracy? That is, a democracy is based on particular values about freedom, about autonomy, about justice, about power. And given this structure in which we live, how should this inform how we teach? How should it be included in our curriculum? Related to this, if there are values that undermine the societies that we live in, where we are going to school, and the fact that people hold their own values, including the teachers and those who create curriculum, as we've discussed in previous lectures, is it possible for a teacher to teach without indoctrinating their students? That is, without brainwashing them into believing particular values or having particular habits? And lastly, should we be teaching particular values in education? So given the social realities of our time, are there particular values that we should teach in order to help society? What are the best ways in teaching these values? Let's learn a little bit about our first author, William Harold Kilpatrick. He lived in 1871 through 1965 and is a very famous philosopher of education. Most notably, he was a student of John Dewey and was a key figure in the progressive education movement that we've learned about already in this class. He was the creator of what is now known as the project method of education. This is the idea that many of us may have experienced in our own educational lifetimes, where teachers guide us in learning by providing us opportunities to engage in projects or activities with others. Many of the ideas that Kilpatrick brings up in this author and in many of his other works throughout his career were derived from his experiences as both a son of a Baptist minister in Georgia and as his experience as a teacher in the public school system as well as a principal of a school. After gaining his PhD from Teachers College at Columbia University, William Kilpatrick became a professor of philosophy of education and taught at Teachers College, Columbia University. We will review his arguments for what he thinks is problematic about indoctrinating students through education, which we'll see connections to the ideas of the hidden curriculum and the power of the teacher that are brought up by Ivan Illich and Paulo Freire. We will also examine whether or not we think Kilpatrick's argument about avoiding indoctrination in education is even possible and even something we find necessary or beneficial. So let's focus on Kilpatrick's argument for indoctrination. Central to his argument against indoctrinating through the way we teach and what we teach, Kilpatrick appeals the idea of democracy. That is, in the American educational system that is rooted in democracy, it is undemocratic to force students or teachers to believe in particular values or to develop particular habits. That it is innately democratic to require students to develop their own ideas and to make decisions about what kinds of people that they want to become, what values they want to hold, what habits they want to have. And therefore, we must resist indoctrination in how we teach as much as possible. In this sense, we can see Kilpatrick as arguing for a value-neutral education to the extent to which it's possible. Throughout the article, he outlines the argument that people have for why they think indoctrination is necessary and valuable within a democratic society, and then he raises his issues with these reasons. So let's look at this in depth. cites 3 core reasons for why people think that it's important for us to force particular values, beliefs, and habits into our students, and for parents to do so with their young children. One argument that is raised on page 274 is that it's unavoidable for us to indoctrinate young children, and in fact it might be desirable or necessary to do so. That is, that if we want to build a habit of being truthful in a young child before they can understand what it means to be a liar or to be honest, we must just tell them and force them to be honest people, and that is a form of indoctrination. Kilpatrick will argue later why this is possible but also avoidable in the later stages of the child's development. But let's first focus on the reasons for indoctrination. So the first one, in summary, is that we need to indoctrinate students in order to develop particular habits they might not understand right now because those habits are seen as socially desirable. For example, this idea of it's desirable for us to force students to be truthful and honest. It's good for them, it's good for the community. This links to the idea that indoctrination is helpful in building a new social order. He raises this idea at the bottom of page 274. That is, if we want our society to advance in a particular direction that we see beneficial and positive, then we need to force particular habits in our students and enforce particular development of values in order to make this future idea and growth of our society possible. Here we can see the ideas that we learned about in the reading Dare We Build a New Social Order by George Counts. And in this sense, Kilpatrick will strongly disagree with Counts that it's important for teachers to use their power to build a new social order. In this way, we can see George Counts as on the side of the benefit of indoctrination if it is being used to help promote a good aim for society, the development of individuals that will help society to be more just and continue to grow and advance democracy. The third argument that Kilpatrick raises for indoctrination, which he again disagrees with, is found on page 275. Here, some people will say that indoctrination is actually very helpful and necessary for democracy, and it's actually not counterintuitive. That, well, democracy, they say, is part of the way that we live our lives. So we're all indoctrinated, and that we don't see a problem with it. So why bother questioning it in our educational system? Another one is that people will appeal to the existence of the current democracy of our society being threatened, and that because of this external threat or internal threat, either within the people of our own communities or from other nations outside of our country, we must make sure that we help democracy survive and also thrive. And the only way to do so then is to make sure that people develop particular habits and beliefs in the value of democracy to begin with. And what better place to do that than in the school? And this relates to the third argument of this idea about it not being undemocratic to indoctrinate for democracy. And that is, in order for our democracy to flourish, we must make sure that everyone accepts democracy as a value, something that's important and central to what it means to be in a community of Americans. In this case, they may appeal to the fact that there are some individuals or groups within a society that's democratic that have not yet accepted democracy as valuable, and therefore, in order to help promote democracy and ensure that it is not challenged, we have to force these types of beliefs and habits and dispositions onto those communities through our educational system. What do you think about these reasons for the value of indoctrination? You'll be asked to develop your own idea in the lecture quiz. So here are the responses that William Kilpatrick raises against those who believe that indoctrination is necessary and important for democracy. He raises the concern on page 274 that indoctrination is tyranny over the human mind. Essentially here he's arguing that by telling people what to think, we're controlling them in a way that a tyrant would control the people that they are ruling over. And that this is essentially a form of enslavement and a way of disrespecting people as autonomous, which are ideas that he raises on page 273 and 276. That is, if we force people to believe a certain thing, to value a particular set of values, and to develop particular habits, and don't give them that choice, we are essentially enslaving them into our value system. And in this way, we're not respecting people's ability to think for themselves and to come to their own conclusions about who they want to become, what they want to believe in, and what they value. And essentially, indoctrination treats people as means and not ends. He raises this issue on page 276. That is, that we treat people as objects to help us achieve our end, that is democracy or a better community or the survival of our cultural identity. And we're not treating them as ends in themselves. That is, we don't treat them as people who have the ability to be who they want to be and not to serve some particular aim that we have in mind for them, but that they get to choose their own aims and ideas of the future and how they contribute to that future. He also raises this idea that if we indoctrinate people into a particular value system or into developing particular habits, they will not be well informed as to what those values really are and what those habits need and how to apply them. That is, that we cannot trust people to apply these values intelligently, to do them reliably, to do them correctly, because they don't really understand what those values are, and won't be able to differentiate between when those values are needed and when they're not needed, and they may not be motivated to use or activate those habits when necessary because they won't fully embrace them. They're kind of just following what they've been told, doing what they've been told like robots. In this sense, Kilpatrick is saying that the best way to make sure that people develop a good habits and a true sense of beliefs and a legitimate value system, we must make sure that they understand what it is that they value, why they value it, and fully embrace the idea that they are the ones choosing to value those ideas. This way, when they are asked to call upon those values, they'll be able to activate them appropriately within any context and be motivated to do so consistently. So this means that Kilpatrick proposes a new way of dealing with values within the educational system. And much of the system is response to the ideas that perhaps indoctrination might not always be completely impossible. That is, he recognizes the challenge that's raised to indoctrination, against not indoctrinating, which is that we can't help it. We might need to do it, especially for younger children. Here he says, this is where intention matters. We need to aim not to indoctrinate our children, either as teachers or parents, by not intending to get them to believe in our particular habits or values, and then that's it. To get them to be brainwashed into holding the particular beliefs that we think are appropriate. That should not be the intention of education. Instead, he thinks that the intention of education is to help a person develop their own sense of habits, values, and beliefs. And that might at first mean that we need to help them develop particular habits before they can have the ability to understand those habits, reflect on those habits, and then accept those habits. And here, the intent is not to brainwash or to have people conform to our value systems, but to give them an experience of what might be valuable. 1, developing habits. 2, that when they reach an age in which they can understand those habits, we provide them with reasons and explanations as to why we value those habits or values or beliefs. And 3, once they reach an age in which they are able to critically reason and reflect on the habits and beliefs that they have, that we as teachers encourage them to critically examine these beliefs and habits that they have been taught in the past, that they have been told are important. That is, we don't stop with just allowing them to accept the habits and values because we've told them that they're valuable, but instead provide a space for students to critically examine these values. That is, are these as important as everyone's telling me? Or why do I value this? Is this actually benefiting me? Is this something that I think is helpful to society? Is this who I want to be? These are notions of critical reflection that he thinks important and is how we intend in teaching, not to indoctrinate. And four, if we give students the space to critically reflect on their values, beliefs, and habits that they've been developing over their lifetime, we also have to allow them to accept or reject the habits and values and beliefs that these students and individuals have. That is, that if we are going to be truly democratic, we have to allow each student to have a voice, to have a choice in who they are, what they believe, and what they value. Which means that if a child determines at an age where they are able to critically reason that they no longer think the value of honesty is important for society or for themselves, for their relationships, we as teachers and parents need to allow them to come to this conclusion, because not doing so would be enslaving them into a belief system that we think is correct, and therefore promoting a form of an indoctrinating education, which he says ultimately would mean that we are rejecting the democratic process. That if we do not allow people to come to their own conclusions about what they believe after they've had practice in trying out different beliefs, then we can't really call ourselves valuing democracy or living in a democratic society. And here he's claiming that education, schooling, needs to mirror the democratic society that exists in. That is, education should always be democratically aimed. In this sense, we can see that there are connections between what Kilpatrick is saying and what we've learned that John Dewey believes in. So let's take a step back and see whether or not we agree with Kilpatrick's critique of indoctrination in education, and whether we think these 4 steps of avoiding indoctrination are actually helpful or necessary in education. One is the general concern that in explaining why indoctrination is bad, that Kilpatrick actually commits the same problem. He is actually promoting a different form of indoctrination. That is, by saying that teachers must respect students' ability to critically think about their own belief systems and to draw their own conclusions, this process of providing the space and encouraging students to reflect in this manner promotes a particular value. That is, a value of respecting others and individuals' choices. But it also models a value of democracy. That is, he argues that we need to allow people to have this space to decide what they believe because it's democratic. And if we were to create this type of space in our classrooms and our schools, are we not also indoctrinating for this value, democracy? Another concern is that Kilpatrick is placing a lot of faith on an individual's capacity to critically reflect on their own values, beliefs, and habits. Do we think that all people will be able to think critically and examine what it is they believe and why they believe and whether it's something they should believe? Do we have faith that all these people will use reason in a way that is appropriate and allow them to come to reasonable conclusions? There is concern that Kilpatrick's use of individual freedoms would allow people to develop habits, values, and beliefs that are anti-democratic or actually harmful to others. And those who critique Kilpatrick's argument in this way often think that indoctrination is helpful if it's aimed at promoting particular values that help society and to prevent harm, in which case we do not want people to have complete freedom over the values that they choose. Another concern is that we could wonder whether or not Kilpatrick's model of not teaching by indoctrinating is even practical or doable in our current educational system. That is, what would it look like for a teacher to help students develop habits, but then let them learn about why those habits are important, and then encourage them to challenge and reflect on those habits, and then allow them to develop and choose which habits they want? Like, is that something that we could do in schools? Is it something we should be doing in schools? Or maybe it's something that is outside of the scope of schools. You'll be asked to reflect on this idea further in a lecture quiz. So now that we've talked about how teaching values can be seen as a form of indoctrination, let's examine what value-based education has looked like in the United States. First, we're going to talk about the history of values in the United States public school system. And then we'll get into the other reading that was assigned for this lecture, Values in Teaching and Teaching Values. And we'll discuss 3 different models of value-based education, the different ways in which a teacher brings values into the classroom, and a few examples from both the United States and Australia. So let's first think about the history of public schools in the United States and how values have been a part of the educational system since we had a public schooling system. So in the 1770s through the 1800s, we started to develop the first public schools in America. And the idea here is that we needed to help create a way of bringing people from different backgrounds together to intermingle and also to create a bond around this new idea of democracy that was coming into shape in the United States. And here we can see that the first notions of schooling, the idea of bringing everyone together for free access to schooling, was underpinned by this value of being integrated, of having people with different experiences and different identities, understanding one another, but also aiming towards teaching a value of democracy, the value of this new cultural and social identity that was emerging in America. Then, in the 1900s, there was an influx of many immigrants into the United States and a lot of movement. And there was a need for an idea of teaching particular values to help preserve a particular way of life that was developing in America that was rooted in democracy, but also to help make sure that particular values were being preserved in order to help advance society. So public schools started to explicitly teach values like freedom and family responsibility and equality to their students. Then, in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a move for schools to start teaching towards more social unity. This was the idea of teaching values that were aimed at addressing the social needs of a society instead of focusing on individual values or individual needs. This was necessary in response to the ending of World War II, where there was a concern about the types of people and cultures that we were developing that would have allowed people like Hitler to exist and to allow people to form communities to support the Nazis and to allow people to not actively resist the Nazi infiltration into their societies. So there is this overarching force, both in America and worldwide, that we needed to teach particular values to help prevent the travesties of World War II from happening again. And this was aimed by developing the sense of social obligation to help preserve society and to help make sure that we don't do the evils that have been done in the past. If you're interested in learning more about this type of educational movement in the 1950s and 1960s, I have attached an additional reading in today's lecture by Adorno called Education After Auschwitz. This explains how we must teach in order to avoid and prevent the horrors of Auschwitz from happening again. So then we move into the 1980s, where there's a heavy focus on the need for skill development, and values began to be taught through the idea of developing particular skills. This is namely the critical thinking skills movements. So values became less focused on morality and ethics and social unity and a sense of social identity, aka being part of democracy, instead began focused on the individual skill development and the idea of becoming prepared for colleges and careers. In this sense, there was a shift away from teaching explicit values, and instead values were hidden within the idea of reasons and critical thinking. That is, what is valuable is the development of particular skills, like critical thinking, creativity, which may not sound like particular values like freedom or fairness, but are in themselves another type of value. That is, that we value people who can think well, or we value the ability to think outside the box. In the 1990s, there was a movement towards teaching in a more globalized and technologically advancing world. So with the idea of us becoming more interconnected through technology, there was a need to teaching values that would help promote students in navigating this increasing globalized sphere that we all find ourselves in. So there was a focus on multiculturalism education, the idea of being able to talk and relate across differences through empathy and understanding. But it also meant continuing the ideas of particular skill development. Those are the skills that would help us to be competitive worldwide, but also to help individuals be successful in their careers and to integrate and work with others in other countries. This then folded into the 2000s, where education began to focus more on the idea of teaching for engaged citizenship. Here, the explicit teaching of morality-based values that were existing in the 1900s come into fold again. And many say this is because there was a general sense in the 2000s that due to the globalized nature of the world and the advancement of technology, that we had forgotten what it meant to be part of a community and forgot and did not emphasize the sense of duty or obligation to those in our community. In this sense, there was a push to teaching children again about the values of responsibility and collaboration so that they could maintain a particular group identity and also be able to engage with others throughout the world. In this sense, it's not so much focused on the individual, but again focused on the idea of social unity. That is, we're teaching students to become engaged in their communities so that they can help their communities advance and become better. In this sense, we're bringing ideas back from the 1950s and 60s. Can you think about how your experiences in your K-12 education system promoted particular values? Let's look at 3 different models of value-based education. As we discuss these different models, please note that there are many other models, such as religious models of education. Today, I'm simply focusing on the public school models of education that currently exist today. This is not meant to be an exhaustive model. So, there are 3 different general models of value-based education. One is character education, where the focus is developing a particular student's character by emphasizing the need for people to have integrity, to be responsible, to be respectful, but also to be leaders and to be creative. This idea of teaching values through education aims to be a little less controversial because it tries to frame values as being a universal value that all people will agree on, like everyone wants to have good character, and that these values are neutral in the sense that almost anyone would find them good, and that no one would have an issue with their child or student learning to develop these characteristics. Character education also tries to aim at teaching values that they see will remain throughout time. That is, these values aren't going to change in their importance or necessity as we progress. That there are core aspects of what it means to be a good person, to have a good character, and that these character traits should be supported and developed within the educational system. So this means that there might not be explicit teaching of character traits, but instead the idea of character is embedded within the different subjects. So when talking about a book, a teacher may raise questions about the different people's character. That is, like, are they good people? Are they bad people? Is this person showing integrity? It might also mean that in the classroom, the teacher has created particular expectations for how students engage with their work and with one another. That is, that you're a good partner, that you clean up your space because you're respectful to the community. And this character-based education often also takes the form of school policies. So you can think about the rules that might exist within a school that would encourage students to have integrity, such as the honor code, or to ensure that students take responsibility for their actions, so expectations around punishment and discipline. But you can also think about those mission statements or ideas or rules or values that are posted throughout the school, such as a good person is blank, or this school values integrity, honesty, perseverance. These are appeals to character-based value education. The second model is moral development education, where there's an explicit focus on developing ethical values. These are the values about what makes something right or wrong, but also about what makes someone a good person. In moral development here, there's an attempt to create, another non-controversial focus on values by focusing on those values that we think make for good people and help develop strong communities. However, it is important to notice that this ethical focus on values may differ based on the cultural backgrounds of the students, the society in which you are teaching, and the general time period. That is, we can think about the value of honor and how it might look different in a particular society, a different culture, or in a different time. In this sense, moral development and value-based education must rely on the particular context in which the teacher is teaching. The general goal here is not to develop a student's character, but instead to develop a particular understanding of the different values that make for a good person and a good society. In this case, there may be more explicit activities in curriculum integration of values. That is, by focusing on developing an understanding of justice and being able to act in a just way, a teacher might create activities that ask students to reflect on different situations where justice may happen or need to be applied, and ask students to discuss this or to reflect on whether or not the character was being just or fair. It also means that there may be activities that place students in situations where they have to reason through what is the right thing to do, in which case they will apply the values of equality or honor or responsibility. Because moral development education is really about developing thinking skills and then applying those skills in practice, moral development education often takes the form of discussions and groups activities, where there is a goal, which is to help students understand a basic ethical concept, but also for them to understand it well enough that they can apply it in their own lives. This is a case in which students are asked to problem solve through an ethical dilemma, and the teacher guides them in the right direction in order to develop particular moral values. The third model is a model that we've learned about in our previous lectures, which is the idea of critical pedagogy. This is a very explicit values-based education that is very narrow in its aim. That is, critical pedagogy, as we've learned before, is focused on creating a more just future, to waking up students to the oppressions and power dynamics of their lives, to help them understand what is happening so that it can be empowered to change their communities and to get out of the oppressive cycle that they are in, or to prevent from being participants in the oppression of others. In this case, value-based education, that's critical pedagogy, focuses on helping students develop an awareness of what power dynamics are at play for them and in the larger society, what the social justice movement is and what social justice is, as well as focusing on the individual realities of the students and helping them problem solve how they can break out of the cycles of oppression that they may be in. This means that critical pedagogy takes a very explicit focus on values-based education, but remember, it's narrowly focused. It's not all the things that make you a good person, such as character education. It's not all the ethical values that help you decide what is the right thing to do, like moral development, but instead critical pedagogy is focused mainly on social justice issues. And this is done by picking particular lessons and curriculum subjects to teach, to engage students in learning in a particular way where the teacher is seen as a guide to help wake the students up to their realities and to push them into questioning and challenging the power dynamics. But it also means that the school and classroom needs to be restructured so that the teacher becomes student and the student becomes teacher. In many cases, critical pedagogy is seen as a radical pedagogy because it is so explicit in its value focus, and it does not aim to be neutral. It is very upfront with trying to confront a particular issue through a particular value lens. What model do you think is the best way of approaching values-based education, if you had to pick one, and why? You'll be asked to develop your ideas in the lecture quiz. Now let's look at the 3 or 4 different ways in which values can be infused within the schooling system. These 4 models are explained in our reading, Values in Teaching and Teaching Values, these selected excerpts. So one way in which values enter the school and enter the classroom is by how the teacher chooses to focus on a particular aspect of the curriculum. That is, most teachers are required to teach a particular topic, but then the teacher has freedom to choose how they focus on that topic. And that choice in how they focus can reflect particular values that that teacher has. Similarly, a teacher may be able to create their own goals or personal objectives in addition to the required goals or objectives that are prescribed by the state curriculum, the national curriculum, or the school's policies. In selecting particular objectives for their students, for aiming toward development of particular skills, or developing particular understandings about topics, teachers also infuse their values within the school and then therefore on their students. So we can see that a teacher focus of the curriculum and objectives can be one way of indoctrinating students. So if we look at the reading more closely, there are a few examples of how this is possible. It might be possible that in talking about the issue of the environment, the teacher chooses to focus on a particular issue of air pollution, and in doing so may assign particular readings that suggest that air pollution is human created, is problematic, and what industries are doing to hurt and continue to allow air pollution to get worse, and what policies need to be in place to prevent air pollution. In this case, the teacher is focusing on a particular aspect of the environment that they have to teach, air pollution, and is focusing on developing the idea that air pollution is bad and human created and therefore needs to be addressed, as developing a particular value within their students. That is, the value of valuing the environment, but also the value of personal responsibility and the value of caring for nature. In a similar situation, a teacher may choose to focus on, within this curriculum, the development of particular skills. So maybe they want to focus on the development of critical thinking skills and problem-based skills, and therefore ask students to engage in activities that have them use these skills. In this way, the teacher is focusing on developing a particular value, right? The idea of being able to think reasonably. So they're valuing reason and problem solving. Another teacher who may be assigned the same curriculum may instead focus on developing students' ability to collaborate and discuss with one another. In this case, they're focusing on social emotional learning and therefore promoting particular values about what it means to be part of a community, about how to cooperate with one another. When talking about objectives around comprehension, we can also see that the values of the teacher and what they choose to focus on can be a form of indoctrinating students. That is, if I'm a teacher and I'm focusing on objectives that are about understanding simply what the text is saying and being able to tell me what that is by telling me the truth and what you know, I'm valuing a particular type of knowledge, and therefore saying what is valuable is to be well versed. But I might also be a teacher that in trying to test for understanding, that I focus on how you make connections between what you've read and your own life, in which case I'm promoting a particular type of value of personal connection, of how what we know can inform how we live, in which case I'm promoting a particular value that is focused on the individual and about relevancy. Another way of values sneak their way into education is through these subjects themselves. So it might be the case that there are some subjects that lend themselves to teaching particular values. We can think of what types of values tend to be ingrained in English classes versus science classes versus math classes, right? Where science and math seem to be subjects that promote this idea of particular notions of truth and therefore promote values around this idea of objective truth. Where subjects like the humanities, history, and English may promote different types of values just because of the nature of how we treat them. In which case, we can think of English and history as developing different notions of truth about the ideas of interpretation and personal experiences and personal bias, and therefore lends itself to different ways of developing values of what is true. But subject-inspired values can also mean how the teacher themselves understand the subject, their field of study, and the general goal of learning about this subject for students. That is like the broader aims of learning the subject itself. So if we look at the reading on page 119, it gives us a few examples. One is the example of literature. So it might be that an English teacher sees that the larger aim of English is to help students discover themselves, to understand the world, and to understand each other. That is part of this general way of self-discovery, and therefore is developing a particular value of understanding yourself, right? But another English teacher might see that understanding English and engaging in literature is not at all about self-discovery, but instead about promoting a general awareness of different topics, about a general education, in which case the teacher is promoting a value that is quite different than the idea of the focus on the self and discovering oneself, but instead focused on all of humanity and understanding the history of ideas. This then influences how the subject is taught. So teaching methods. How a teacher engages with a subject will implicitly teach particular values. So if we think about the types of questions the teacher asks, the way the teacher manages the class, the different activities the teachers ask students to be engaged in, these all reflect different types of values. Whether the values are focused on the community, whether the values are focused on the individual, whether the questions or activities encourage critical thinking or creative thinking or very literal thinking or comprehension. These are all different types of values that are being taught in the pedagogy that the teacher chooses. You can think about our class and how the different ways in which I teach might promote particular values. We can also think about teaching methods as in how teachers actually deal with teaching particular values themselves. So In the reading on page 120, they outline different ideas for how teachers choose to deal with teaching values like courage or justice or honor. And how a teacher chooses to avoid these topics or chooses to engage these topics is a form of indoctrinating as an explicit way, but also in an implicit way. So, for example, by choosing to not teach a particular value because you think that it's going to be too controversial, but because you think that the teacher shouldn't be teaching the value, because you think that for any of the other reasons, by choosing to avoid teaching values when they come up within the curriculum, you're suggesting to students a particular value notion, which is that values are not part of the educational environment, that controversy is not okay, that everyone is entitled to their own position. And then teachers that choose to engage in teaching values explicitly, maybe they decide that they want to take on the idea of justice head on in their classroom. How they choose to do that is going to be a form of indoctrination, right? So if I choose to teach justice and I tell you that justice is a great thing and I promote activities that get you to the conclusion that justice is important and necessary and valuable, then I'm explicitly indoctrinating you into the value of justice. But similarly, if the idea of justice comes up in the classroom, and as the teacher I allow us to have an open discussion, and I don't tell you what I think, and I allow everyone to take sides, and I don't allow there to be a clearly right or wrong answer, it might be that I'm promoting a particular value, which is that justice is important to consider, but that perhaps there isn't one way for justice to be understood, or perhaps that justice as a value is controversial and still up to debate, that maybe it's not something that everyone should believe in. This is also something that I'm teaching by how I teach the value. And lastly, the article talks about how who the teacher is influences the values that they teach. That is, that the teacher's attitudes and behaviors in the classroom model particular values. So if a teacher is very closed off from their students, is very standoffish and very strict, it might be modeling a particular value about the teacher-student relationship, about what education is about what knowledge is. It may be teaching particular values about power, for example. And then teachers' personality and their interests may also teach particular values. That is, if a teacher's personality is very outgoing and warm and understanding, then it might suggest that it is valuable to students to develop similar dispositions. And in developing those habits, they have been indoctrinated, as Kilpatrick has said, that by demonstrating being open and understanding, a teacher is pretty much endorsing that these are good characteristics because they themselves have them. A teacher may also bring in their own personal interests within the classroom, in which case they might be promoting a particular value in doing so. So if I share that I'm very interested in volunteering and giving back to my community, and I talk about all the ways in which I donate my time to help others, I'm promoting a value of compassion or empathy or of service, and therefore I'm indoctrinating you as students. So let's look at what this might look like in practice. So the U.S. does not have a national values-based educational framework in which, values are required to be taught at the educational level. And this is mainly because we like to think about education as being separated from church and state, where values are seen as the field of the home and the field of religion, and education is separate from those things, and therefore there's no place for values in public school education within the United States. So let's look at a different country and how they've justified the idea of bringing values into their education very explicitly. That is, that they have a framework and a policy that says values should be taught in schools and this is how they should be taught. Australia is pretty recent in developing a national framework for values-based education. There's a long-standing history of value-based education in Asia and also in Europe. If you're interested in learning more, you can look there. So, in Australia's national framework, they have to make an argument for why it's necessary for all of their public schools to teach values in the first place. So, one claim that they make is that education is about building character, that it's not about just developing skills or general understanding of ideas, that, like, one of the reasons why kids go to school is because they need to become better people, that it's character. So, again, we can think of this idea of values education as character based education. And then they appeal to some of the research around teaching values to kids in an educational context. One is the claim that teaching values helps strengthen students' self-esteem, that once they develop an idea of who they are, they feel more confident, and therefore that helps their learning. The other reason that they appeal to is that values-based education has proven to help promote a sense of personal responsibility and also social responsibility. So they're making the claim here that it's important for people to be personally responsible for their actions, but also that they need to be part of a community and be responsible for that community and helping that community out. And because value-based education helps do this, and that's why they think it's important for it to be part of schools. So what does this look like in practice in Australia? So for Australia, values educational framework, and we'll look at what those values are, need to be part of all of the aspects of schooling. So each school must have policies that reflect the different values that Australia says is important for students to develop, and their mission statement for their school must also embody these values. But it's not enough for it to just be on paper. Australia is looking for the school culture and the general environment in the classroom to demonstrate these values in practice. That means that teachers and students, parents and principals and staff must follow these values and live them within the school themselves. They also think that because the idea of developing personal responsibility and social responsibility is a necessary part of values education, that schools must promote opportunities for students to engage in community issues, either issues in the school, issues in their local community, or national issues. And that by providing that, they have an opportunity to engage their values and practice them. This also means that the values need to be incorporated in the teaching program. So here they mean both the teacher education program, so teachers need to learn about these values and learn how to teach these values, but that these values must also be part of the curriculum itself. So, what are these values? So Australia appeals to 9 different educational values, and you can think about whether these values are ones that were part of your schooling experience. 1, care and compassion, so caring for yourself and for others. 2, you must value doing your best, which is, trying hard work. 3, fair go, pursue and protect the common good where all people are treated fairly and for a just society, so essentially justice. 4, freedom, the idea that everyone has freedom and that we should make sure that everyone is free. 5, honesty and trustworthiness. 6, integrity. 7, respect. 8, responsibility. And 9, understanding, tolerance, and inclusion. Do you think that all of these values are necessary for education? Is anything missing? Let's look at a few examples in the United States. So even though the United States does not have a national curriculum or requirement for teaching particular values, there are values that are hidden within each public school's mission and vision statements. So let's look at Amherst, Massachusetts. Quote, "The mission of our school is to provide all students with a high-quality education that enables them to be contributing members of a multi-ethnic, multicultural, pluralistic society. We seek to create an environment that achieves equity for all students and ensures that each student is a successful learner, is fully respected, and learns to respect others." So we can ask ourselves what values are going to be endorsed in the Amherst, Massachusetts public school system, either through school policies, through school culture, through teacher modeling, teaching strategies, or the curriculum itself. When we look at the last sentence, we can definitely see that there's a value of respect that is being permeated throughout the educational system at Amherst. We can also see that equity might mean that they are going to talk about equality. In the first sentence, they're talking about multiculturalism, so we can assume that they might be teaching values of being part of a community, about respecting differences, and about cultural and multicultural understanding. Let's look at Cleveland, Ohio. Quote, "We prepare all students for college and life by providing a challenging curriculum that connects students' lives and their futures in a safe, supportive, and nurturing environment." So here we might need to dig a little bit deeper to see what those hidden values are that might be inadvertently being indoctrinated into the students of the school district. So we can think of the college and challenging curriculum as valuing future success or competitiveness. We can think of the idea that connects to students' lives and their future as valuing practicality or personal identity and experiences. And we can think of safe, supportive, and nurturing environment as valuing community, respect, safety, compassion, and understanding. You're going to be asked to examine the Newark, New Jersey school mission statement for its hidden values as part of the lecture quiz. So let's end today's lecture by reflecting on some of the questions that could be brought up as we think through the different ideas of indoctrinating through education and the different models of value-based education. One is, what values, if any, should we be teaching in schools? Do you think that there are set values that are important for all students to learn and that should be done through the indoctrinating model that Kilpatrick is against, or through the way that Kilpatrick models through the idea of indoctrinating with the intent of having them choose democratically what to believe? What do you think is the best way to teach values if we have to do so? So what of the three models did you think is the most appropriate? And then thinking about how all of this relates to your personal experiences in school. How were you taught different values? What were these different values? And did you think it was appropriate for the teacher to be teaching these values in the way that they taught those values?